Magic is a tolerant mind frame that allows for all all the different definitions of itself, of magic, to pass through it. Meaning that there can be no denominations, no limits, no boundaries. It's just basically a mind frame. And we could also call it the transcendental, transcendental experiences, whether it's, mystical or psychedelic or whatever. I think it's like a key thing in human life and human culture, and also in the human individual mind, the need for transcendence. And when we say colloquially, we talk about magic, you say, wow, that movie was so magical, or this music was so magical. What does that mean? It means that it was something extra. It means that it took you out of your ordinary consciousness for a brief time.
Hey, everybody, and thanks for joining me today on the Creativity and Consciousness podcast. Today, we have an exciting episode. It's an interview with Carl Abrahamsson, who is somebody that I've looked up to for a long time within the world of magic and the occult and his work as an artist. And Carl Abrahamsson is a Swedish writer, filmmaker, photographer, musician, and publisher. He has extensively explored themes related to occulture, which examines the intersection of occultism and culture. His work includes both fiction and nonfiction, contributing to a variety of mediums within the arts. We talked about his latest book titled Meetings with Remarkable Magicians, and I put a link to that book in the show notes if you'd like to order it. We talked about the intersection of magic and creativity. We talked about what magic is, and we talked about how his path as a creative individual and as an occultist and a magician unfolded in a magical way filled with synchronicity, and how individuation is an important part of the process, both creatively and magically. It was a very enriching conversation, and I really hope that you'll enjoy, and perhaps also check out the other episodes of my podcast that I recorded in the past with Carl Abrahamsson. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to the Creativity and Consciousness podcast, a space to explore the intersection of creativity, spirituality, and personal transformation. I'm your host, Jake Cobran, visionary artist, author, and your humble guide in the exploration of our consciousness. In each episode, we dive into ideas related to magic, visionary art, and alternative spirituality. I bring you conversations with leading thinkers and innovators to help us tap into our creative potential, expand our minds, and transform our lives. Whether you're an artist seeking inspiration, a spiritual seeker exploring new paths, or someone on a journey of self-discovery, this podcast is here to help unlock new possibilities and awaken our inner power. Let's journey beyond the ordinary. Welcome to the Creativity and Consciousness podcast. All right, welcome everybody. I am honored and excited to have our guest today, Carl Abrahamsson, who I've had on my podcast several times in its other forms. And it's always a great inspiration and joy to talk to you, Carl. And how are you doing?
Thank you for that, Jake. It's good to be back. I've been very fine. Business as usual, but it's good. Just writing away more book projects, both the other people's books that I'm publishing or the publishing in part. But the thing that really makes me tick and happy is, of course, the books that I'm writing myself. So I'm trying to move more and more into that sphere, and it's going well.
Mm-hmm. And you manage two publishing houses, right? They're the Trap Art.
Trap Art is the one that's active now. And for instance, publishing this one, The Fenris Wolf, which is almost annual, that kind of thing. And then some art projects. Trap Art did take a lot of time. So I've sort of decreased that workload a little bit. But Fenris Wolf will always be on Trapar in a way. That's my pet project, something I could never let go, even if I wanted to, because it's been with me for such a long time. And I feel it's kind of like the creative or cultural backbone in my life, because it's like a center around which many cool people spin, and ideas and history and the contemporary times and speculations about the future. And it really makes me inspired to work with that. So there will always be some kind of publishing going on that is not specifically my books. I just can't help it. I've always been like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're an excellent guest to have on the show because the themes are creativity and consciousness, and your work, especially regarding a culture, certainly relates to both of those subjects equally, as well as their intersection. And I'm curious if you could tell our listeners a little bit about that. Firstly, if you could give us a background on yourself as an artist, as well as your explorations into magic and consciousness, and how that journey for you as an explorer of the occult, as well as an artist, has tied together into this singular path of a culture that you have heralded for so long.
Right. That's a big question, Jake, but I'll be happy to to dive into that. Basically, I think the story usually begins with most people. You're a kind of a teenager, and you're interested in things, and you want to sort of break away from the inertia or the parental environment, and whatever they like, you don't like. And I think I was no different. I wanted to rebel, but at the same time, I come from a very cultured and sort of intellectual home. So there was lots of art and books around. So I wanted to break away, but at the same time, it was so infused in me. I just had to find some other kind of art and some other kind of books, which I did.
Didn't it say that your parents were friends with Andy Warhol or something like this in your book?
No. They were on the Andy Warhol had a famous kind of let's call it an early retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm in 1968, and that's the story where I just mention it in my magical autobiography, that I was present at that opening, but I was only like 2 years old.
Okay, I see.
So that's where the Warhol connection was. My parents did have a Warhol. I remember. I don't know what happened to that, but anyway, I found myself being very curious, and in a way, I could find some cool stuff in my parents' bookshelves. But it was all about the quest, looking for things that you resonate with, and at this time we're talking about, I would say, early 1980s. There was still a lot of good bookstores in Stockholm, Sweden, where I grew up, and even occult ones. So I drifted there, of course, just as I drifted into the cool record stores and started loving this kind of, I would say, I was a little bit too young for the first punk movement, but the post-punk and the new wave, certainly I was in the eye of the storm in a way. Finding so many cool bands, so much, cool music. And that was parallel to this occult exploration through books, basically. You buy these things that are classics, Crowley's Book of the Law, LaVey's Satanic Bible, that are, they were always there. So I got those and started. And I found, great resonance with LaVey, for instance, to a certain degree with Crowley. That mainly came later. And I would say an intuitive kind of guidance going on, basically checking out what was there. You feel the resonance with a work or an author or a band, and then you check out what inspired these people, so it becomes like a detective work or a puzzle in a way. And at this time also, there was the industrial music scene, and very common in that scene was that there was a lot of intellectual fodder. It wasn't just like a band producing music that was great to listen to. It was packed, with stuff, with references to the surrealists and occultists, and it was like an entire environment within the so-called musical scene that I found incredibly intriguing, highly inspiring, and I sort of got into that more and more, with Throbbing Gristle and then with Psychic TV And as you know, Psychic TV had this, magical group called the Temple of Psychic Youth. And I started subscribing to their information. And then as the 80s moved on, I got involved with the Temple of Psychic Youth and found it, incredibly cool and inspiring because of the fact that they weren't making so many allusions or references to what's called, the Museum of Magic, like the arcane stuff, the Western ceremonial system. I mean, that's all fair and fine, but this was something that was so incredibly contemporary and built a mythos around ideas coming from art, coming from literature, also from psychedelics. It was fascinating. So I got involved in that, and then so many things happened at around the same time, and now we're more like mid 80s to late 1980s, where I, of course, as you did, you started a band. I started a band called White Stains, and we made this record, Sweet Jane. The first record we made was like a tribute song to Jane Mansfield and her involvement with Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan. And Genesis said, "This is cool, you should send this record to LaVey. I have his address." And I thought, yeah, what the hell, nothing to lose. So I did. And then I got a letter back from him. And of course, can you imagine, I was mind blown. It was just amazing that this person that I had sort of projected so much coolness on now wrote me, and we struck up a friendship. And the year after, 1989, I went to San Francisco for the first time, and there were a lot of doors being opened for me on a magical level. Not only LaVey, but also Kenneth Anger, because I had been at Stockholm University writing about Aleister Crowley's influence in Kenneth Anger's films. So I got to meet him, and many other things happened at the same time. And that was like the first, game changer, I would say, that American trip in 1989, where I realized that basically thanks to, again, I would pay homage or mention the Fenris Wolf, because that was only like a fanzine at this time. But I got really cool people to write for it. William Burroughs allowed me to reprint an old psychedelic piece that he had written. LaVey allowed me to use his stuff, and Genesis also. So suddenly there was this occultural fanzine that I had going that had great reverberations in this, fairly tiny world. But it was a very influential world for me, obviously. And from then on, it's just like, wow, what's going on here? And it led to consequences for me in the sense that I felt immediately at home with these people who are essentially creative magicians. You have the creativity. Anger made films. Genesis was an all-round artist. LaVey was a beautiful musician. And there were other people also. There was never really anything about the occult as occult, the occult as going into, magic school. That also came in my life, but slightly later, because I felt that, it's worth checking this out in a solid, foundational way with, like, for instance, with Thelema and Crowley system.
Absolutely.
By joining the OTO, and then also, the Golden Dawn for the really classic stuff.
And Crowley himself was an artist as well, and primarily identified as a poet, and published quite a lot of poetry and novels.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that if I were to look at things with retrospective goggles, which I've done recently with the book Meetings with Remarkable Magicians, I would say that the only occultists who really interested me are the ones who have this strong creative urge, creative vein, because they weave that into their magic. And of course, vice versa also. They weave the magic into their art. So I got off to a good start, and then I went through life, and I did become involved with the OTO and One Little Golden Dawn group, and, going through magic school, basically. And then much later, I sort of came out of that on the other side, having formulated a stronger, more assertive voice in understanding myself as a creative person, as an author. But I've also, as you know, I made films, I made a lot of music, worked a lot with photography. There's always been this urge to create something new in media that I feel very comfortable with. I've always loved movies, so I want to make movies. I always loved music, so I wanted to make music. I always loved photography, so of course, you pick up a camera. And then you realize that, yeah, these are not only creative tools to, for instance, make a record or write a book or take a picture. It's all about integrating these into a ritual framework, a ritual mind frame, in which all of the things you use become like little magical rituals, basically filling your work not only with a desired end result, but with an overarching intent, which is to be on the magical path. And I think that writing this book has been an eye-opener, because I had to revisit so much of my own life. And I'm, very happy that I started writing a diary in 1987, so I could go back through all these, endless volumes of blah, blah, But it was interesting because there were so many things that I'd forgotten. And the same thing with photography. I could revisit my old negative binders and go through images that I'd taken, meetings with people that I'd, technically forgotten about, but then came back to me. So you have these sort of, again, like Spare said, atavistic resurgences, but from my own life. And that was very, very, gave me a better perspective about my own life and about my own magic in that life, or in this life so far.
I'm curious, if you examine the sort of progression of your life up to this point, do you see clues in your early development and your childhood into these kinds of occult interests or into these creative interests? And I'm just curious, what do you think draws these particular people, these kind of rarefied individuals, onto this path, whereas other people may never discover it?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of it has to do with exposure, and either the privilege of being allowed to be in your own headspace, or if it's, by accident, or you make your space so you can be alone and fantasize and stuff. Daydreaming and fantasy, very, very important. But if someone keeps telling you, no, this is bad, do your homework, whatever, more authoritarian thing, then that might either dwindle away. The creative urge might be so discouraged that it dwindles and dies, like like an uprooted flower in a way. Or it can become compensatory, meaning that the person who is oppressed creatively will bounce back, and usually in a very compensational way, meaning there will be maybe too much will involved instead of allowing the process to be like a flow way. These are very general remarks. But I think that exposure to culture and exposure to magic, there's so many stories, some mythic, but some also real, about, kids revealing something to someone who sees immediately that, wow, here's another little magician, and give pointers and advice. But it's probably easier to talk about that when you are talking about culture as being magical. I was allowed to roam free, to read American underground comics and comics for adults, as it was called, that had titties and all kinds of stuff, and a lot of magic, of course, meaning the culture of fantasy in adult comics and underground comics, in movies. There was no like real censorship from my parents' point of view. So I saw a lot of weird films, and that has been with me all my life. And I think these things also, as mentioned, I think that played a good part. I got my cradle, my literal cradle as a newborn by Ornette Coleman, the avant-garde jazz musician, because my father had a jazz club at this time. So there are a lot of jazz people around, American musicians coming to Stockholm to play. And I grew up in this, it's like kind of free-spirited environment with lots of weird stuff going on. And of course that affects you as a kid. So I think exposure to the different ways of behaving and creating is very important. Of course, I didn't realize it was weird until I grew up slightly and saw that, my friends aren't like this, their parents aren't like my parents. And that, of course, creates kind of a distance, and you want to distance yourself from your parents. But in retrospect, I love it. I feel very privileged that Ornette Coleman, buzzed my parents' apartment door and had bought me a cradle. It's like, this expression, the hand that rocks the cradle.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing. So I feel very blessed in that sense. But maybe the greatest blessing after all is that my parents allowed me to be exposed to these things. Then later on in the story, I knew or I realized that my mother had known Crowley's works when she was young.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
that was before the reprints started happening, It's like we're talking about early 60s, 1960s. She had been not interested in, but Crowley was kind of a cultural figure. He was around still. And my father, of course, very much a beatnik kind of guy. He worked his way over to the US in the late 50s, basically peeling potatoes and these ships to be able to get to New York to go to these jazz clubs. And he, of course, as a beatnik, knew all the cool, literature that was going on. I'm thinking, of course, of Burroughs and the Beatniks. And he also went to Morocco in the early 60s when the beat guys were there, So I can see how it's trickled down, not in the sense that they educated me, but maybe, there's genetic ripples, what you fill your own mind with is moved on through genetics to your kid. I don't know. But I'm just very happy about everything. And I'm not surprised that I am the way I am. I have done enough psychoanalysis. I have done enough retrospecting. And now I've written this book. So I'm ready for the next phase. And the working title of the book was actually 2 times Saturn, meaning I've come through 2 Saturn returns now, or very soon. And I feel very ready for the next phase of magic and, of course, of creativity. For me, they're very, very linked.
Mm-hmm. And to speak on Crowley's idea of the true will, to me, it seems you're somebody that I feel is quite in alignment with that and follows that calling very clearly. But I'm curious if there was ever any tension or complication for you in discovering and living in accordance with that. For example, did you feel anything oppressive or limiting from your parent culture or from the people that were around you when you were growing up that might have dissuaded you from following this strange path into a culture? Or was that always quite clearly laid out for you?
I think no, there was it wasn't any kind of violent reactions or anything like that, but maybe they were a little bit disappointed because I come from conservative but fairly well-to-do environment, whereas my grandfather was a doctor and I'm like a medical doctor, and my father was a historian, my mother worked at an art gallery, and it's like all these kind of highbrow things. And I realized very early on that I wanted to write, always loved writing. So even, for instance, when I was in the comic book phase, I had a fanzine about comic books, writing about that. And then later on when I got more involved in music, I had a fanzine writing about music. So I've always been like a writer first and foremost. So the obvious thing for me then would be to become like a journalist, which I did. I started journalism school or college. And everybody was like, yay, finally he's doing something. But I dropped out. After 1 semester because I just couldn't take it. They were trying to mold people into writing these banal, schematic stories for newspapers. That just wasn't me. And since then, I did do some other like university courses or worked or just normal stuff, because the real work for me was always what I was doing after work, what I was working on when I came home and editing fanzines or publishing books or writing or making music. My life has always been very filled with that kind of creativity. And, over the decades, that creativity has taken more and more and more place. And now I'm free, at age 58, and that feels wonderful, meaning I can create a sustenance based on what I put out, what I create. But it takes time, if you're not, catering to some kind of commercial market. But I never have been. I've always been more interested in experiencing experiencing things myself, and then sort of reformulate them and filter them and give them back to people. Over time, that means giving them to a new generation, for instance, because the people that I worked with who are my magical mentors, they're all dead, but I can sort of keep one spirit alive, which is my conglomerate spirit based on all the input I have, and relay it. And that's basically my focus now of trying to relay what I know to younger people.
Mm. And it sounds like the more you became in alignment with that, the more that path just naturally opened up for you, like to have all these remarkable opportunities, these synchronicities around encountering people like Genesis Peerage or Anton LaVey. And that sense of synchronicity and flow is also something that I've discovered when it feels like I'm living in alignment with my true will, and is part of the clues or the evidence that you're on the right track.
Yeah, totally. For me, synchronicities are like total evidence that you're on the right path, whether short term or long term. And I think that that of course comes from the Jungian universe. And now I feel very much at home in the Jungian universe with his terms. So instead of we talk about Crowley and the true will, I prefer nowadays to talk about individuation, as a process. You come to different degrees of individuation, which is the same, fulfillment, fulfilling your potential based on inherent talents you have, stuff you've learned along the way. And of course, there's always more. It's not you never reach the goal, you just die. and then basically, I think that for me, I feel more comfortable using that rather than the true will kind of thing, because I was in the OTO for 30 years, but I decided to take a step back or to leave because I found that more and more the focus had come to be more on the religious aspects, and that was never interesting for me. Crowley as a prophet, the Book of the Law as a holy book, and it's a religion, la da da. I'm not sure I'm buying it. Initially you buy it because you're glamorized by Crowley's glamour, basically. But he was right on the money concerning a few things. One of the things was to move on with this philosophy of will. He got it from Nietzsche, basically. And Nietzsche got it from Schopenhauer. It's basically the German philosophy of will that Crowley repackaged in this beautiful syncretic package of Eastern wisdom and Western ceremonial magic. Brilliant guy. And I think for me, that would have been enough, or maybe it should be enough. But then, of course, he came from a rabid Christian fundamentalist background. So, of course, when he rebels, he becomes the great beast, And then, of course, later on, he becomes the prophet, It's just like a religious psychosis that becomes transgenerational, and it's not healthy. And I think that the confluence between the philosophy of will and this kind of, almost paradoxical religious thing didn't sit well with me. So I moved on from that. But I do have a great respect for Crowley and also for the OTO. But I think they should focus on the fraternity, and cultivating inspiration for members of, them cultivating their own path and their own true will, and not have so much really fluff.
Yeah, I think I really like the way that you put it, of just fulfilling and actualizing your potential. That when I read Crowley and a lot of the other writers, including Genesis Peerage with their work in the Temple of Psychic Youth, I see that as being a really core theme of just discovering who we truly are and making the most of our abilities to realize and enact our will within the world. And I think there can sometimes be even some confusion from people when at an entry level into magic, where to me that philosophy is a very core part of magic and magical philosophy. But then there's also the act of magic in the sense of sorcery or witchcraft, which is a part of that, but is also its own thing. So I'm curious, how you reconcile those differences in intention, or that word being used to denote these different things. And if you have a personal definition of magic that either leans towards one side or the other.
Yeah, no, good point, good question. I think I do, and I think it still holds up. I formulated it as that specifically, magic is a tolerant mind frame that allows for all the different definitions of itself, of magic, to pass through it. Meaning that there can be no denominations, no limits, no boundaries. It's just basically a mind frame. And we could also call it, I think both you and me are familiar with and comfortable with the concept of transcendental, transcendental experiences, whether it's, mystical or psychedelic or whatever. I think it's like a key thing in human life and human culture, and also in the human individual mind, the need for transcendence. And when we say colloquially, we talk about magic, you say, wow, that movie was so magical, or this music was so magical. What does that mean? It means that it was something extra. It means that it took you out of your ordinary consciousness for about a brief time. But that in itself was obviously important, because you talk about it with your friends to check if they had a similar experience, which very likely they had. So that kind of thing is that, magic is a mind frame. It is also that transcendental mind frame to perform a ceremony or ritual in, say, for instance, the Western ceremonial tradition, with, invocations and planetary things. And it's like this huge system, right? But if it doesn't give you a transcendental experience, it's just psychodrama. It has no effect, because whether you accept magical forces as being external, you can call them different things, just external, or whether you think it's something psychic, something inner, it doesn't really matter. People have different definitions. But if they don't lead or provide for that kind of transcendental experience, then there's no state of mind in which you could, plant the seeds of change, where you could declare your intention either concretely with an expletion or expression, or symbolically with a sigil or a mantra, but you need to come to that ecstatic level in your mind frame. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's like, I believe that there are many paths that provide magic. So magic is basically the mind frame that allows for all the definitions of itself to pass through, to exist, to coexist. That's why I think the non-denominational aspect is very important. Is that you can't really point your finger at someone else, because you don't know what they're going through, in terms of transcendental experiences. That's why I can pick on, for instance, monotheist moralisms, but I would never pick on someone from a monotheistic background claiming to have had a transcendental experience that they would call God or something similar. That's fair and fine. We're all looking for languages and discourses and symbologies with which we feel comfortable, with which we feel resonance. And I think that's part of the path. It's like zigzagging. It's not a straight path, but you zigzag in between these resonances. And if it's a lesser resonance or non-existent, you move away from there. And if there's something that appeals over there, that where you find resonance, you stay in that, or you move through that. And it's the same thing. We have these nodes of consciousness in a way, which are not flat. We need to have these peaks. And then, of course, you can argue that, well, logically, then you also have to have slumping, go down. I'm not so sure. I think that as you move along on the path of individuation, you learn from each peak experience and integrate that. And that, I think, was the problem with the possible illumination that could have arisen from the psychedelic movement of the 1960s, for instance. Things could have changed even more in general culture, but they didn't, because people didn't have the tools or the language or the culture to integrate those peak experiences. It was just something cool you did in the weekend, and then you drifted back into the Monday morning mind frame where you went back to work. But I think that on a magical path, whether that includes psychedelics or not, it certainly doesn't have to. I think that you learn to appreciate the peaks that come in ritual, for instance, and you value them and you integrate them as your mind frame is a tool also, and you build on that. You build further movements and adventures and insights with those tools that you sort of generate yourself. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it does. And it seems that there is this need, this desire for transcendence in all human beings to a certain extent, and people just find different avenues towards that experience. So somebody might resonate with a magical tradition, an initiatory tradition, or witchcraft, or somebody might resonate with shamanism, or even an organized religion to provide that sense of transcendence. And in my upcoming book, The Path Within, you contributed an article about the history of magic. And I think that need for transcendence and a way of facilitating transcendence to a tribe or community was something that you talked a lot about within that. And I'm curious if you could also share more about the history of magic and how this fundamental need for ecstasy plays into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think over the recent years, I have formulated it as source magic. Source magic is basically the realization that everything we have as human beings, as individuals, as a culture, a tribe, whatever, or the entire global population, we all come from the same space. And it's a fairly recent development that we have, fulfilled these promises of Homo sapiens excellence that now prove to be quite disastrous because we're hubristic. But we all come from the same space, living in very, very small communities where you have to survive, basically. And that means, other enemies of a similar kind, or animals, or nature in itself, and you huddle together. That's the origin of, the fire and the tight-knit glue, the social glue, where you tell stories to pass the time in the dark night. But also the people who go beyond, the shamans who try to find out, information in different experimental ways, and they bring that back. And if it works, that's great. He becomes like a proto-scientist, or she, basically saying, what if we do like this? I saw in a vision, or I had this dream about this. Let's try to, leave this river and move over here. That's what I saw. And if they do that and survive, that will become like a very primitive form of empirical action, a method in a way. And that survival instinct is the same one that we have today. We are, most of us, at peace. There are no major threats. There is no need for fight or flight. We're complacent and perhaps too comfortable. I don't know. But basically, we still inherently have all of that embedded in our DNA. And integrated in that is the thing that I call source magic. It's the inherent respect of the epistemology, where knowledge comes from. It comes from the inner planes evoked by a transcendental mind frame that was originally shamanic, with the drumming, the singing, the dancing, the sex. It could be many things. And as we became more, complex because of numbers, quantitative issues, there had to be proxies. So you have priests who talk about these things instead of perhaps performing them, and people accept it because there's so much in life to think about. So everything becomes diluted in a way, but that doesn't take away the genetic need for higher states of consciousness on an individual level. We have a kind of a hidden insight, an unconscious insight into the fact that we need these things. For most people, unfortunately, it takes social cues, social context, where it's okay to drink, for instance, alcohol. It's part of the same thing. You become temporarily ecstatic, but it never really leads to any great epiphanies or substantial insights. It's just like you flare up like a flare, maybe have sex, and then you have a hangover. Whereas other people can go other routes when it comes to weekly pleasures, whatever. But it's still rooted in the same inherent need in the human psyche, also in the human unconscious, to go beyond, And if you can't do it yourself, you will have to look for it or for someone else to do it for you in a way. And that's why occulture now is very interesting, because I think that need for the source magic seeps through, and then we have Jung again, like with the collective unconscious. We get messages saying, hey, people, shape up, be attentive to these things rather than these mechanical, causal, materialist things. They have their place also. But if you only work with them and forget, planetary consciousness, our own individual consciousnesses, and the need for transcendence, then the entire organism will be suffering. That, I think, is what's happening. And that's the reason why we have so much occulture going on. Magical things. I was going to say magical mushrooms. I don't mean the literal ones, but just like mushrooms popping up here and there in movies or books or trends. It could be super superficial. That's all fair and fine. Or it could be kind of highbrow, like myself in a way, or other like literary experiments, but still under some kind of occult umbrella. That's also fair and fine. We need all of this stuff, even the bad stuff, basically to bring out magic in the light, saying there is no, there's nothing weird about this. It's just very, very basic human behavior. And I think if you go into other cultures, it's more natural for us as Westerners. Yeah, it's been, ostracized and moved to the side. But now suddenly it's out in the open, and everyone, many people that I talk to who don't really know my work, when you start scratching their surface in a, shallow social context, there is something going on there. People have weird experiences and they feel, fine with it, and also fine with talking about it. It could be like seeing ghosts or communing with a deceased ancestor or things that are completely natural. And you and I can talk about it as if it's hyper natural, because it is. But for most people, I think they feel a bit inhibited in talking about these things. But I think general culture, at least in our Western sphere, is loosening up and allowing for these things to exist. And it's not escapism. It's not some conspiracy theory to keep people, down in fantasy land, whatever. It's real energies coming up from the, I would say, collective unconscious, from our individual unconsciousness linked to everyone else's. And it's a call for emergency, because we need to wake up to a world of magic through which we can make other kinds of decisions in a faster and more constructive way.
Yeah, I've recently been rereading The Soul's Code by James Hellman. It's a really good book, but he was talking about parenting and how in ancient cultures, somebody would have been seen to have been raised in a community of spirits and ancestors to which they had a relationship and that they would have paid respect to. And I just feel that that's something that we really lack, that we have basically our parental figures and maybe our grandparents, but I can imagine that to be raised in a culture that really embraces that ecology of spirits and ancestors and influences would allow a person to feel a lot more connected to their environment, to their culture, and to a sense of kind of duty and responsibility and honor that comes with that as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why generally polytheistic cultures are healthier, because they usually have a pantheon. And of course, all these gods and deities and call it orishas or spirits, whatever, they all have quite particular functions or they represent very particular things that are, of course, just like facets in the spectrum of the individual psyche, rather than have one angry sky daddy saying no or maybe yes. It's better to have the whole array of creatures all stemming from your own mind, and you can talk to one of them concerning some things and with another about something else. But it's just healthier thing, I think, and that also goes. It's very tied in with ancestor worship, or just basically, let's call it ancestor acknowledgement, meaning that it is absolutely possible to commune or communicate with your ancestors. Why would that be such a strange thing? We are all carrying genetically those people, imprints from those people we have in our very, on a cellular level. So why not? Why shouldn't I be able to communicate with them? And I had, I can't remember if I wrote about that in the Remarkable Magician's book, but I did write about it somewhere, I think maybe on our Patreon. Anyway, this thing where my father was a historian, and on my mother's side, I come from basically like two interlocking noble families in Scandinavia. And they were really vain. So they had good actual records of where they came from, way, way, way back. And that's very interesting. And for me, it's been like a great foundation to stand on. But it also blew my mind when I looked at it. My father had provided me with some, genealogical records. And there was this moment where one Swedish king that I'm related to, had kind of a battle, to the death. It's like Norwegian kings and Swedish kings fighting it out about, regions and stuff. And it was just outside of Stockholm. And the Norwegians had sort of caught up with him and his entourage. And he had nothing, he couldn't do anything except for jump from a cliff and down into the lake or the ocean. So he survived by basically escaping. And I thought, wow, good for you. Thanks for doing that. Made me the person I am. But then when I sort of say, what the hell? Am I also, I thought, am I not related to the other guy as well? And I checked, I was. I'm related to the Norwegian king as well, who was going to fight it out with the Swedish one. And, that was like a mind blower. Them failing to kill each other allowed for me to be alive, basically, and be the person I am. I mean, that's one of the most remarkable epiphanies or mind-blowing experiences I've had, was realizing that. So if I can communicate with those guys, it's great, and I can, because I say I can, and I can go into that mind frame and be very grateful. Thank you for failing to kill each other. And maybe I can give them, as any other spirits or ancestors, some kind of materiality. I can allow them into the temple in a way, and allow them to be present and feel that material experience that you can have. And I think they appreciate that very much. I have actually done that with several of my ancestors. And Vanessa, my wife, and I, we also have like an ancestor altar, both for biological ancestors, but also for what we call adopted ancestors, meaning cultural figures that have been important parts of our life and our creative developments. They are also placed on the altar because they are our adopted ancestors.
Yeah. A few days ago here in Bali, it was Kuningan, which is one of their major holidays, in which there's a culture-wide, island-wide celebration of their ancestors. And I think this idea of mind frame is important because the Balinese mind frame, in terms of the relationship to spirits and to ancestors, is quite different than growing up in the West. And I also thought about, for my own connection with ancestors, the minds that shaped me, like my artistic and intellectual influences, as being my ancestors as well, because I have taken on their ideas, and those ideas live through me and continue to grow in a way.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's such a magical thing also, because all of the people who did the pioneering work during dark times, dark, oppressive, monotheistic times, and were not only ostracized, some of them were even killed, like witches and two visible pioneers. But the pioneering spirit in general is really unbroken, isn't it? From the Greeks or before that even. Again, maybe we could draw it back even to the original source magic experiences of the caves, of the shamanic experiences in the caves. That spirit is kind of unbroken. And what I mean by that is that the pioneers, for instance, of science, they were looked at as heretics, meaning like they put a religious thing, oppression on top of something that was basically just in awe, the joy of finding things out about how nature works. That was dangerous to, threatening to the structure that was there. But even, that spirit is the same. We carry it onwards, and I'm very conscious about it because I'm trying to consciously talk about my lineages that have become my lineage in a way. I have several great rivers flowing into my ocean, but it's my duty to bring that, not only pay back respect, which I have done now with all the major people, but I'm also paying it forward, basically moving the spirit along to the next generation. And being conscious about that puts my work in a different context also. It's not just me trying to be a writer or to pose as a magician. It's like actually doing the work, because that's really what it's about. This thing where fulfill intentions, fulfill your goals, that's wonderful. But after a while, you realize, or I have realized, that it's sort of, you come to the point where it's almost running by itself. If your engine and your vehicle is well served, you can go down the path in a cooler way and see more things and experience and reach the goals. But it's not something you have to do consciously. It's just you're so immersed on the path and in the path that it takes care of itself in a way. And that leaves energy and mental capacity to think about these things on a meta level, like the meta magical level. What is it that's going on now? And why am I doing this? Is it only to reach a goal or have a pleasurable experience or sustenance? Yeah, all of those things. But there's something higher on the meta magical level, and that's just moving the spirit along, formulating the spirit in my own words, because that's what everyone else before me in my particular lineages have done. I have no choice but to do that.
Yeah, and in a way, those are stages of actualization. Like you probably, at a certain point, you were more concerned about maybe some individual goals, like how you're going to support yourself as an artist or your status within a particular scene or hierarchy or these kinds of things, that once that's fulfilled and kind of solidified, then you can move up that chain of ascent into higher purposes and higher intentions.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's totally true. And it's not like it's not a calling. I am very wary of Crowley again, and now Crowley's legacy and sort of taken care of and co-opted in a way, not by the OTO so much, but by freewheeling Thelemites. By the way, it's basically Crowley's fault, isn't it? By calling himself a prophet, then you paint yourself into a corner in which you're either ridiculed or misunderstood or even worse, worshipped as such. And I don't know which is worst. But so I'm wary of how I express this. But what I just said, I think makes the most sense to me. I'm the temporary holder of a certain spirit, and it's my duty to move the spirit onwards so that other people can be inspired by the spirit. And then, you can call that spirit blaha blaha, you can call it gobbledygook, you can call it whatever you want to, that you feel a resonance with. I think I'll just call it like, a nameless kind of thing. It's best because everyone has their projections on whatever I would call it, so I think it's just, I can call it a creative spirit because that's really what it is. It's about realizing that creativity is about creating something new. And then that can be in context. For instance, we can create something new that will change what we perceive as unhealthy within a culture. But it could also be creating something new for the pleasure of creating something new. Like if you have a blank canvas, like you do, Jake, at times, then you paint on it. And then it's something new. And then you can take that painting, you can keep it for yourself and say, this is amazing, I'll keep it only for myself. Or you could exhibit it and show it in a greater context and talk to people about it who are curious. There's so many degrees of where the created can actually go. But for me, I'm interested in the actual process where human beings have it's not a tendency, I think it's an instinctual need to create something new, to change what's bad, of course, into something better, but also this thing where you do something from absolute scratch. And that would be taking an inner experience that you have, which is intangible to other people. Only you see it, you can feel it. But then if you give it form, it becomes inherently magical, because you do that maybe to purge it, to exorcise it from yourself, or because you're so happy that you want to share it, because it was something that affected you with joy, and you give it a more general form and share it. And people will say, wow, that's really cool. Or they'll say, oh, you're nuts. It sucks. You can't do that, but you can make it. That's the only sort of duty you have, to follow that drive.
I wanted to also talk to you a little bit about the ostracization of magic within contemporary Western culture, either from scientific dogma or through people with other spiritual practices or beliefs. And I'm curious from your perspective why there is so much fear that surrounds occultism, and why, you have associations with Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. There are people that would potentially, I don't know if they're listening to this podcast or not, but might find this podcast and hear that and be very frightened by that, and would find Anton LaVey to be a very frightening person, and the idea of Satanism to be something that is very threatening. And I, having explored those ideas and yourself knowing him personally, I wouldn't imagine you think that, but I'm curious as to why you think that prevails within our culture and why there is so much fear around these things.
Well, I think it's like that old saying, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. And there, of course, there's cultural imprints, meaning transgenerational input that could be, I think, usually religious, like religious imprints that have moralistic intent, meaning kind of a programming. In a way, it could be a loving thing. Parents want to protect their kids from stuff they find threatening. But usually in teenage times, that's when the kids will go into those territories. And the more the parents try to ban something, the more interesting it will become for the kids. But I think that so in that sense, it's like on the basic level, it's about protecting your kin and protecting your kids. But unfortunately, it takes on these egregorian forms where you have suddenly the moral majority or generic Christian beliefs that may not be Christian at all, meaning have no connection to the Bible or early Christians, whatever. It's something that has emerged in our culture. And then you have to see, what's the deal? Why do they do this? Why do they use Satan, for instance, in these satanic panics or scares? Well, it's just to keep people down, isn't it? Because what's the greatest threat of Satan? Well, okay, so traditionally it's kind of deception, but the deception into what? To people to experience the fleshly, the material, to be happy, to create on your own terms, like the symbol of Lucifer in a way. It's a kind of I don't find the myth in itself very interesting. It's a faulty, impoverished myth. And I'm talking then about basically all of monotheism. It's just not good, not healthy. But if we talk about they said the satanic in the sense of rebellion, a kind of Promethean, Luciferian spirit of enlightenment, then it becomes more interesting, because that exists basically in every culture, not only the monotheist ones. There's always like a rebel figure, someone who's looked at with disdain, but still part of the pantheon, because it's needed in the human psyche to become like a immune defense system, to pinpoint and press where it hurts, so that the organism itself can heal. But how people in control look at these things is that they're potential threats. These spirits, or this spirit of potential personal empowerment, is not good. Because if you have an entire society or culture of people thinking for themselves, then why would they obey the people in control? And that's the nitty-gritty. That's the bottom line. That's really all it's about. And then, of course, LaVey was both smart and not smart in using the symbol of Satan for his church. He was smart in the sense that he wanted to have a splash of controversy and get people to join his church of Satan. But at the other hand, after the heyday, it became, I think, a little bit more of a ball and chain or an albatross, in that constantly have to explain why I chose this symbol and why I did this and why that. So no wonder he became a little bit reclusive and exclusive. So I think that there's power in those symbols, but it can be for good and bad. For instance, people will not be as shocked if you talk about the Promethean spirit. People talk about Steve Jobs or these sort of visionaries that he had a Promethean spirit, but you don't say that, yeah, he was possessed by Satan, because that means something else in our culture, or inspired by Lucifer to enlighten the world or whatever. It's just symbols, and in a way cheap shot symbols, because they're so easy to co-opt and turn against the people who claim that it's something positive. And it's all about power, it's all about control. And you can look at it from the point of view of politics also. If the X party rules, then the people in the Y party will be enemies and they will be scapegoated. They will be foul-mouthed. That's going on right now in the US. It's really pathetic and low, but that's just a sign of their culture, unfortunately, which is part of the Western culture, maybe even global. The people in power need enemies, and that's the power of Satan in a way. That's why the symbol is powerful, because it will always be ostracized and be an outcast. That's part of the thing. There is great power in that, and it can be used very creatively. But on the whole, it's like a focusing point from the point of view of control, where they could, in fact, work with much healthier things. Fix what's bad, fix what's wrong, etc. Mend what's broken.
In a way, it represents chaos or something that is uncontrollable, and what is a terrain that isn't mapped out. And there's always inherent danger in that, like going out into the dark woods where there could be monsters. And I see that spirit as part of what it is to be an occultist or a magician, to go out into these unknown spaces where there could be dangers, and there probably are. But that is part of what it is to be an explorer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And on all levels, it was true for the original explorers who went out onto the white spots of the map. When that was happened, was still maybe 100 years ago. There was still unexplored parts of the world. Imagine that. And imagine being like the explorers of the, say, 19th or 18th centuries, where you came into these jungles and stuff and saw animals you'd never seen before. It's amazing. We don't have that anymore. We can hope for that they're at least documented so we can watch them online on YouTube. But we can find new stuff within ourselves. That's absolutely a reality. And that in itself is highly magical, highly inspiring, highly creative. And the key thing is, which society as such tries to, discard, it's so easy. But you just have to value what you experience as being, true or real. Because it is. If you experience, in a daydream, something that you had not, evoked, you have not intellectually or rationally or mentally evoked that thing, but you just pleasantly drift away and you have this experience, which is different than a real dream, sleep dream, but it could still be, fanciful and involve symbolic elements. Then you have to remember that as much as you can and say, this was amazing. Where the hell did this come from? Well, you could argue, well, it's all from your unconscious. But that's the thing. You have to validate. You have to value whatever it is that flows out from your inside or flows up from your unconscious. You can call it whatever you want. And I think that's one of the greatest detrimental aspects of the culture we're living in, is that so much of that is, you keep the lid on. That's not healthy. I think that we, as you and I, as being creative people, we have overcome, we have won those battles because we use everything as fodder for our art, for our creativity, for our writing, for our paintings, and it's very important that there's an unhampered flow of stuff that may appear to be chaotic, symbolic, whatever. But then again, if you just put on your psychoanalytic goggles and you realize all of this has a meaning to me, I have to see what this means because it means something, that's for sure. And when someone says, no, it's just like, for instance, the dream is just the brain trying to reorganize itself after a long day of impressions. That's the vilest kind of bullshit I've ever heard. And I get, angry when people say stuff like that. It's not. I think we live fuller when we sleep and dream. For me, that's I wouldn't say a more valuable reality, but it's a parallel reality that is equally important to the work that we're doing.
Absolutely. And I personally believe that recording your dreams and at least paying attention to it is one of the most beneficial practices that anybody, especially somebody who has a creative path or is interested in things like magic and occultism, can do. It's a direct line into that symbolic universe that's within us.
Absolutely. And I think, again, that thing where when I was writing this book, I couldn't have done it if it weren't for my diaries. So again, and in my diaries, of course, to the extent that I remember them, I've also written down my dreams. And it was such an interesting experience that I almost had to leave it because that was disturbing the work of seeing the records, the chronological things that I was doing. But those little dream entries are just incredible. And I can see now in retrospect, many decades later, oh yeah, that's really what that was about. Because I have that, retrospective perspective. Whereas someone who, discards the dream, even if they have good dream recall, and you say, oh, it's just a dream, wow, they're missing out. They're missing out on a lot of very substantial information.
And Carl, would you mind sharing a bit about your new book, Meetings with Remarkable Magicians, I believe it's called?
Yeah, absolutely. Meetings with Remarkable Magicians, Life in the Occult Underground. This is what it looks like. And basically, it is the story. It's not like a complete autobiography, but it focuses on the magic. The people I've met who became influential and inspiring on a kind of a mentorship level, Genesis Purich and Anton LaVey, Kenneth Anger, and other people also, some of which are, unknown, but equally important. And I sort of chronicle my path and my reasoning, and again, this path of resonance that I've felt has been so important, meaning it's not like a curriculum where, now I have to do like 3 years of this kind of study or something predictable or causal. It's been very much zigzagging, like I said before, in between resonances. And I mean, the first anthology of essays that I put together was called Resonances. And this, of course, it's a punny mix of reason and resonance. And I think that's been very, it's a good term for what I've been up to, finding these resonances. So in part, it's a chronological story, what I've experienced, who I've experienced it with, but there's also some, I would call it almost teaching in there, meaning my own philosophical deductions, also talking about my own creative processes within these media, writing, making films, making music, how that has affected the magic, especially, for instance, in collaborations, active collaborations with Genesis Purich. Now we made music together and films and traveled together, and up to a point which is fairly recent, where I'm now moved out of Stockholm, where I lived for 55 years, and now in a more rural setting, and working with magic and creativity in a different way. So in a way, it is very much a journey. The book is a journey through my own life, with me sort of being the narrator in a way, or the protagonist, just trying to make sense of this, because some of it makes no sense, but it's also not nonsense. It makes a lot of sense to me, but it was a very interesting challenge to try to convey this in a coherent way to people who might not be, magicians in the same way, but to make it an easy read or an enthusiastic read to convey that joy that I have felt throughout my life in being on this path, because that's something I want to share. It's been somehow a bit topsy-turvy, but it's on the whole been so incredibly empowering, joyful, creative, and amazing that I cannot find a different way or a different word than to call it magical, because it has been. So it's both on a meta level and for real also. I've led a magic life, and in part it's because I made those initial choices to go in certain directions, but then also allowing for the bigger flow to pass through, to allow the magic to pass through. And then, remarkable things will happen. You will meet remarkable people, and some of those people will be magicians.
Are there any particular experiences that you had that you shared about in the book that were particularly impactful, or that come to mind as being some of the more extraordinary experiences? And would you mind sharing a story with us?
I mean, they could be, of course, many of the experiences that have been, pivotal or important have been like transcendental or magical, and they can be hard to formulate in a coherent manner. But just in terms of these meetings with remarkable magicians, there are many, of course. And I think that first trip to America was fascinating in 1989. I had just basically finished a thesis at Stockholm University about Crowley's influence in Anger's films, and that was one part of a cluster of things that allowed me access to him in Los Angeles. But the main thing was that, so I have been corresponding with Anton LaVey and Blanche Barton for about a year, and I have saved up the money to go to the US for the first time, and then get welcomed to, the Black House there. It's just like so mind-blowing, because it's all my teenage fantasies come to reality, really a magical experience. But then there was this moment where I had vaguely planned. I was in San Francisco. I was vaguely planning on going to Los Angeles and hoped to meet Kenneth Anger, but it was like kind of problematic back then. No emails, no internet, nothing. But then, as I was about to leave on the first night of meeting LaVey, he said to me that I was just on the phone with Kenneth, and I told him, "You're a cool guy." And that was the thing that sort of opened the door so I could go to Hollywood and hang out with Kenneth Anger, which was another super magical, super mind-blower experience. And of course, I think I could have done it on myself, but it was LaVey's call to his old friend Kenneth, who opened that door. And I think there was this guy, Bob Colacello, who was the editor of Andy Warhol's Interview, the magazine that they had. And I interviewed him at some point, and he said something along the lines of, it was through Andy's help that I was welcomed into these new environments for me, but it was my own, I could thank myself for being invited back, so to speak. You have to, when someone opens a door for you, you go through it and you behave and you assess and you see if it's something for you. And if it is, you play along. You play by the rule books that are for those specific rooms or houses. And I think I've done that really well, because I've been involved in so many different, occult environments or magical environments. And I've been active in them, not just like, a passive member, but I've been active working with them. It's true for the OTO, true for the, American branch of the Golden Dawn that I was in the Church of Satan, Temple of Psychic Youth, certainly. So I've been like an active player in trying to immediately pay back for the inspiration that the environments have given me. And what I've done recently is, of course, to pay back also in tangible form, the Into the Devil's Den documentary about LaVey, the Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan book that was based on the film in a way, the documentary with Kenneth Anger called Cinemagician, the book Sacred Intent with Jen, which is our interviews from 1986 to 2019. That's a long span where we consciously made interviews or talk to each other, recorded that for the purpose of one day having a book that chronicles magical thought in evolution. So I mean, there are many. I remember fondly and vividly traveling with Jan in Nepal, just going to these incredibly magical things and talking about magic and doing magic while in such a magical place. Jan had been there before. I had been there actually the year before and returned the year after, but together with Jan and Lady J. And it was just, remarkable, because one part of this book that became Sacred Intent was that we should do interviews in different parts of the world to let the sort of genius Loki, the spirit of the place, be part of the conversation. And that was extra powerful, I think, in when we were in Nepal. So this just loads of memories, loads of interesting meetings and synchronicities and fantastic things. So I'm very happy about the book.
Were there any conscious magical endeavors that you undertook to open those doors, or did it just unfold synchronistically and naturally?
Yeah, it became it was conscious. I mean, from the beginning, when I was active in Topi, I was super active magically, meaning doing a lot of rituals, and it was all causal in a way. You know, I want this to happen, I want that to happen, and it worked. You know, creating kind of a vortex or a hurricane of my own, where I could be in the eye of the storm and see how things changed around me. And then those things included, you know, we need to make a record. So that became the Sweet Jane record. And we want attention for the band. So you did something for that. And then, of course, that happened in that Jen liked the record and thought that I should send it to LaVey. And that led to the opening of that particular door. But already at that time, I had been in touch with, you know, when I got that first letter from LaVey, we were in touch by letter, and him allowing me to use some material for the Fenris Wolf, etc., etc. So he could see that I was a doer in a way. I think that was a reason why I was invited there the first time. And so, I'd done, for instance, rituals for being able to go to the US, which, you know, is basically a matter of generating money. But then, of course, I'd worked with the Kenneth Anger thesis and written about anger, admired him so much in his work. So that was kind of a ritual in itself, and that led to me having access to him, and that led to another kind of friendship that lasted for a long time also. So I'm kind of a long-term friend to these people, which is good. Absolutely. Whenever it is that I've wanted something to happen, I have very likely ritualized it. You know, done something very concretely ritually to make it happen. But then my perception of that, or my experience of that now, is that it's more of a flow. I could make things happen in different ways. It doesn't need to be in any kind of traditional ritual framework, or it could just be, I wouldn't go so far as just need to think about it, but it could be different, more calm, mellow ways of working, like with mantric magic or with meditations. I think that has to do with age also. You're not so, you know, causal. I want this to happen and I'm going to make this ritual, you know, and then you do it. It's like this roller coaster of causality. Now I hope and I perceive myself to be more in a very calm and mellow mind frame, maybe more Eastern oriented in a way, and not so Western causal. I think that would sum it up in a way.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing all that. I'm definitely excited to read the book. And I wanted to leave this conversation with the question, if you have any suggestions for somebody who's listening to this, who maybe hasn't tried to do anything magical before, what's a small act or ritual or practice that somebody listening could undertake to just step a little bit in that direction, or to dip their toes into the magical waters? Yeah,
that's a good one, because that's also a great responsibility, you know, to get people, to nudge them to move along the path. I think to begin with, there needs to be always a parallel path, and that's the parallel path of individuation. You know, initially you have the path of, say, ritual experimentation, but it needs to be parallel with the path of individuation, meaning you have to tie these things up You don't do things like Mickey Mouse in the Sorcerer's Apprentice section in Fantasia. We just go by a magic book or an old grimoire and do something. It's kind of pointless. But you need to lock it. You need to anchor it with something that will be good for you on your path of discovery of yourself. So therefore, I would say initially, if you want to go, if you feel that you want to go on a magical path, I think the best thing to do is actually to begin with meditation and to learn to be focused in yourself, to know your body, how it reacts when you do still meditation, and the mind, of course. So yeah, I would go for that. Also yoga in general, because it teaches you about the fact that life is energy. You know, when you make very simple kind of hatha yoga exercises, you learn about these energy flows that you have in your own body, your system. And they, of course, go beyond also. So I would say begin on kind of an Eastern kick, you know, with yoga and meditation. And if one wanted to experiment, then maybe check out mantric magic, meaning that you make a mantra of your own that you can work with when you're doing meditation, for instance. It's not something that has to do with wands or these classic tools. It's just you communicating with deeper or higher levels of yourself. That, I think, is a good beginning. Make your own mantras that become like symbolic messages to your own unconscious, and you work with them in stillness when you meditate.
And so would the mantra reflect a particular goal or aspiration that someone has?
That could be exactly it. And, you know, for instance, check out Austin Osman Spare and his view of sigil, which is like a graphic form. But you could also, of course, turn the sentence expressing what you want to achieve, or the word even, or the name, and, you know, toss the letters about. So it doesn't have that rational meaning or association, but just turn it into something else, like chaos Scrabble in a way, so that it becomes something new. It's still the same meaning, but it becomes symbolized. And then you take that name or sentence or phrase that sounds like gobbledygook, but you just repeat that to yourself when you're meditating, and that will have a very powerful effect, because it's something expressed by you, but it's taken away from your rational, critical mind and gradually dropped into your unconscious, to the liminal space of in-betweenness, and that is where the magic happens.
That's something I've often done in tandem with creating a visual sigil, where you can create a mantra of the letters as well and repeat it simultaneously throughout the ritual. But that sounds like a great exercise that anybody listening can try, and I'm excited to see what the results are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a soft and good thing to begin with, because if you throw yourself into the temple with all the beautiful, you know, so-called magical tools or magical weapons and a nice robe and stuff like that, it can become like a little bit too much, and it becomes psychodramatic instead of proto-creative. And I think it's best to embark slowly, because you don't know yet when you set out. You don't know which magical system or tradition really appeals to you. You have to learn by default by making mistakes and stuff. But sometimes you don't have to learn from your own mistakes. You can also learn by positive connection to the resonance. And therefore, it's good to start out slowly. And this kind of meditative approach is, very powerful, yet it doesn't have all the theatrics that can be, disturbing at times in the beginning.
That's very wise advice. Thanks for sharing that. And thank you, Carl. This was an awesome conversation. I really appreciate your time and your insight and wisdom, as well as your writings and the work that you do. And I'm very excited to check out this book. When is it being released, and how can people obtain it?
It was just released October 1st, globally. I think the UK, it will be sometime in November, but it's on, you know, Amazon.com globally, or the local Amazons. And basically wherever books are sold online or in stores. It's available now, and it's I would personally highly recommend it.
Excellent. And I'll put a link to the book in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, so thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening. And let me know your thoughts, your feedback on this particular episode. And I'm looking forward to carrying forth this conversation in the shimmer with all of you soon. So thanks again, Carl.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Jake. Wonderful.
And yeah, that was awesome.
Thank you for tuning in to the podcast. I am the DFT Elf. Escaping into your dimension. New episodes of the Creativity and Consciousness podcast dropping feed. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you'd like to stay connected and join a like-minded community, hop in the Telegram group where we discuss the latest episodes and ideas they spark. Sending you instant love and gratitude for being part of this journey.